I heard the scream before I saw the taser. One moment, my 13-year-old son was helping carry groceries from the car, and the next, an HOA Karen was lunging at him across our driveway, shrieking something about unregistered visitors and aiming a live taser straight at his chest. He froze, terrified. She didn't. That crackle of electricity was the moment she crossed a line so dangerous she didn't even realize she'd just lit the fuse. Because what she didn't know, what she never even stopped to consider, is that I'm a police officer, fully trained, badge-wearing, and I just watched her commit a felony. What do you do when someone threatens your child and doesn't know they've just made the worst legal mistake of their life? When we moved into West Willow Preserve, we thought we were stepping into a peaceful, suburban dream tree-lined sidewalks, identically manicured lawns, and streets so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat at midnight. The HOA sold itself as a community of care, which sounded sweet enough at the open house. My wife liked the symmetry. I liked the school zoning. And my 13-year-old son, Mason, was just happy we finally had a driveway big enough for his scooter ramps. What we didn't know then, what we couldn't have possibly imagined, was that behind the calm and the clipped grass, there was something rotten, something cult-like. West Willow Preserve wasn't a neighborhood, it was a kingdom, and at its helm sat a woman named Karen Holloway, HOA president and self-proclaimed community coordinator, though no one could ever recall actually voting for her. Her influence was like mildew in a crawlspace, invisible until it started warping the structure. She ran the board like it was a courtroom, weaponized newsletters like subpoenas, and ruled with a porcelain smile and a clipboard that never left her hand. At first, we got what everyone else got: the standard welcome packet, the laminated rulebook, and the friendly notice about our trash bins being visible from the street on non-collection days. "Just a heads up," she scribbled in fine-tip purple ink, to help keep the community looking its best. "Okay, sure, I moved the bin." Week 2, we got another note, this time about non-compliant grass growth. Ours was apparently a quarter-inch above the harmonized blade cap. That one came with a photo, taken from somewhere behind our fence. I laughed it off. Barely. My wife suggested we trim twice a week instead of once. Mason didn't say anything. He was busy building a new ramp out of scrap plywood and dreaming about nailing his first 360 spin. But then it started shifting. Subtle at first. Karen began making offhand comments directly to Mason when he was outside. "Aren't you a little big for that scooter?" she asked one afternoon while he was coasting down the sidewalk. "Some of the other residents say you're too fast, it startles the older dogs." Then came the citation for excessive wheel noise, which arrived in our mailbox with a blurry picture of Mason mid-turn, his face pixelated by motion blur, and the caption, "Aggressive street behavior." I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. She filed it as a Category 2 disruption violation with the HOA. I decided to let it slide. Maybe she just needed a hobby. Maybe this was her hobby. But Mason was starting to dread going outside, and every time he did, Karen just happened to be walking past with her clipboard in hand, pretending to check mailboxes or document curb appeal infractions. He told me once quietly over dinner, "Dad, I think she follows me." I told him to ignore her. That was my first mistake. It got worse. She started hovering near our house in the late afternoons. Always just out for a walk. Always just concerned. One Friday, Mason came home pale and silent. He wouldn't talk. Just went straight to his room. I found out why an hour later. Karen was standing at the edge of our driveway, phone in hand, pointing the lens directly at our garage. I walked out, calm but firm, and asked what exactly she was doing. She didn't flinch, didn't look up from her screen. "Collecting documentation," she said smoothly, "for a pattern of safety issues. Your son doesn't always come to a complete stop before entering the driveway." I stared at her. She tapped her phone a few times and added, "And he operates his scooter without a helmet on occasion." I was so stunned I didn't even respond. She wasn't angry. She wasn't flustered. She was thrilled. Like she was a detective catching a career criminal red-handed. I stood between her and my house and said evenly, "You need to leave. Now." She smiled. "Of course. Just doing my duty. And with that, she turned and walked away, still scrolling through the gallery on her phone, like she'd just nailed a Pulitzer-winning exposé. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the HOA bylaws open on my laptop, highlighting phrases like community enforcement and behavioral patterns of concern. My wife stood behind me in silence. Mason was asleep, finally, after a restless 2 hours of tossing in bed. We didn't talk much, just read page after page of vague language that gave Karen just enough rope to hang whoever she wanted. The next morning, she was back, this time pretending to water a flower bed near our front walk that, to my knowledge, didn't belong to anyone. She glanced at Mason's ramp, snapped another picture, and made a note. I stepped outside slowly, and she looked up, unsurprised. "Didn't realize this was your flower bed," I said calmly. She tilted her head and smiled. "It's all our flower bed, in a way. Collective harmony." And just like that, she turned and left again, leaving the hose running, the water soaking into soil that didn't need it. That weekend, I installed a motion-activated camera on our front porch, not to catch thieves, to catch a neighbor, because it was clear now we weren't living next to a Karen. We were living under one, and she had just begun. The first time I noticed the new poles, I thought maybe the HOA had finally gotten around to fixing the busted streetlights. They'd been promising safety enhancements in the monthly newsletter for over a year. The poles were thin, almost elegant, with small black globes perched neatly on top, like futuristic lampposts designed by someone who hated aesthetics. They appeared overnight, installed at strategic points around West Willow Preserve corners, cul-de-sacs, and oddly enough, right at the entrance to private driveways, including mine. At first glance, they looked like lights. At second glance, they weren't lights at all. No wiring for illumination, no bulbs, just black domes, each with a faintly visible lens behind tinted glass. Cameras. Karen called them community safety monitors in her email blast, written with her usual syrupy fake concern. To ensure the safety and harmony of all residents, the HOA has installed motion-activated security monitors in compliance with our new neighborhood safety ordinance, she wrote. Please remember, if you see something, say something. There was no vote, no warning, no consent, just surveillance, staring at our homes like silent sentries. I stood at the edge of my driveway, looking up at the black eye pointed directly at my front door, the hair on the back of my neck rising like a warning from some primal part of my brain. I wasn't the only one who noticed. That night, the neighborhood group chat lit up with angry messages, questions, confusion. Who approved this? Why weren't we told? Is this even legal? Karen's responses came fast, like bullets. For your protection. An urgent matter of community concern. Approved via Emergency Bylaw 17.4. I dug out the HOA charter. There was no Emergency Bylaw 17.4. She made it up. It didn't take long before Mason became the first target again. 3 days after the cameras went up, we received a behavioral warning in our mailbox. The letter claimed that Mason had violated the 9:00 p.m. community curfew for minors. I read it twice, then 3 times. There was no curfew. There never had been. Mason had been outside at 9:15 p.m., skateboarding quietly in our driveway under the porch light. He wasn't breaking a law. He wasn't disturbing anyone. And still, the warning was delivered in a bright red envelope stamped "Second Notice," even though we'd never received a first. I called the HOA office and demanded a meeting with the board. The receptionista woman, who always sounded 2 seconds from a nervous breakdown, told me meetings were by invitation only, but promised to see what she could do. 2 days later, I got the email. You may present your concerns briefly at the start of the next scheduled meeting. It read, please note that disruptive or hostile behavior will not be tolerated. Hostile behavior. I hadn't even spoken to them yet. Still, I went. I wore my cleanest uniform shirt, badge clipped to my belt not as a threat, but as a reminder. I wasn't just some random homeowner who could be pushed around. The meeting was held at the community center. The same sterile beige building where we'd signed our paperwork years ago, still smelling like fresh paint and suppressed resentment. Karen presided at the head of the table like a queen overseeing a feudal court. Her minions, 2 yes-men board members, and a compliance officer who looked like he'd gotten lost on his way to a mall cop convention flanking her on either side. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it short, calm, professional. I outlined my concerns: illegal surveillance installations without consent, fabricated curfew rules, harassment of my minor son. I asked for the bylaws authorizing these new measures. I asked for the names of the contractors who installed the cameras. I asked for clarity on the appeals process for citations. Karen sat with her hands folded primly on the table, smiling that same porcelain smile she used when issuing fines for invisible offenses. When I finished, she cleared her throat delicately, like she was about to deliver a eulogy. "We understand your concerns, officer," she said, emphasizing my title like it was an insult. "However, several residents have expressed fear and discomfort regarding your family's pattern of behavior. The cameras were installed in part due to escalating tensions caused by hostile individuals." Hostile. She said it again. Another board member nodded solemnly, like he was attending a funeral. I realized then that it didn't matter what evidence I presented. They had already written the script. I was the aggressor. Karen was the victim. I pressed on anyway. "Then please provide documentation," I said. "Resident complaints, incident reports, anything you've received regarding my family. I have a right to review it, if you're using it as the basis for enforcement actions." Karen's smile thinned. "Due to privacy concerns, we are unable to share sensitive resident feedback." "Then the citations are baseless," I said. "And illegal." She didn't answer. She just tapped her pen against the table in a soft, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat trying to hypnotize the room. I left the meeting empty-handed but more determined than ever. That same night, the fines began. Not warnings this time. Fines. Real ones. 50 for unsanctioned driveway activity because Mason practiced scooter tricks on the concrete. 75 for excessive visual clutter because my wife had planted a flower pot too close to the sidewalk. 100 for unauthorized mechanical repair because I changed the oil on my motorcycle inside my garage with the door open. Every letter came with photos. Blurry, invasive photos taken from angles that could only be captured by someone aiming a camera directly into our yard. Some were obviously from the new poles. Others looked handheld, as if Karen herself had stood behind the hedges with her phone in hand, snapping evidence for her tribunal. I requested documentation again. Dates, times, names of accusers. Karen refused. Officially, through a curt email citing resident privacy protection policies that didn't exist anywhere in the charter. I started documenting everything. I bought a second set of cameras and mounted them discreetly around the property, facing outward, facing her spies. Every letter I received, I scanned and saved. Every confrontation, I recorded. Every email, every citation, every notice, I archived them with timestamps and witness statements when possible. I wasn't building a defense. I was building a case. A real one. Because it was clear now that Karen's war wasn't about rules. It wasn't about order. It was about control. And she had decided that my son, my family, and my home were the threats to her empire. The neighborhood watched in silence. Some sympathetic, some scared, some pretending not to notice at all. But I saw the way they glanced at the cameras when they walked their dogs at night. I saw the way their shoulders hunched when they passed the HOA office, as if afraid to draw attention. West Willow Preserve wasn't a community anymore. It was a surveillance state, a neighborhood under siege. And Karen Holloway stood at the center of it, smiling her polished, pitiless smile, writing new rules with one hand while she sharpened the knife with the other. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. Not yet. I wasn't just some angry homeowner. I wasn't just a father trying to protect his kid. I was a trained police officer. And I had just gone from reactive to proactive. The clock was ticking. And Karen had no idea. She had just started a countdown she couldn't stop. It was a Thursday afternoon when it happened. One of those ordinary, forgettable days when you're just glad to get through work without incident. Mason had texted me he was heading home from the park, the last few minutes of daylight still hanging over West Willow Preserve like a thin veil. I was still finishing up some paperwork on the kitchen table when I heard the commotion outside. At first it was just a voice shrill, strained, slicing through the humid evening air. Then the barking escalated into full-blown screaming. I bolted out the front door, my heart already hammering against my ribs before I even saw what was happening. Karen Holloway was standing in our driveway, less than 2 feet from Mason, her face twisted into something animalistic, not the usual smug, composed facade she wore like armor. Mason stood there, frozen, his scooter dangling loosely from one hand, his backpack slung off one shoulder, his entire body stiff with fear. Karen was pointing at him with one shaking hand and holding something metallic in the other, a taser, bright yellow, civilian model, but fully functional. The crackling hum of it charging filled the air between them. "You're trespassing," she shrieked, spit flying from her lips. "You don't belong here. This is private property." The insanity of her words would have been laughable if it weren't so horrifying. Mason was standing on our own driveway, 10 feet from our own front door, and she was brandishing a weapon at him like he was a home invader. My voice roared from deep inside me, faster than my brain could even process the words. "Karen, drop it!" I was already moving, hand instinctively reaching for my badge clipped to my belt, other hand raised to show I was unarmed, approaching fast but measured, the way they teach you when dealing with a volatile subject. Karen spun toward me, the taser still sparking, wild panic flashing across her face. "He threatened me," she screeched. "You're threatening me." She stumbled backward, losing her footing on the curb, but caught herself before she fell. Mason was still frozen, wide-eyed, one small step from being tased by a lunatic in broad daylight. "Karen Holloway," I barked, my voice dropping into the command register I hadn't used since my academy days. "I am a police officer. Stand down immediately." I held my badge up high enough for her to see. Clear, official, undeniable. For a half-second she blinked, her mind trying to process the catastrophic mistake she had just made, but then she did what cowards always do when cornered. She ran. Spinning on her heel, she bolted down the sidewalk, shrieking something incoherent about assault and self-defense, as she disappeared between the hedges 2 houses down. Mason dropped his scooter, ran to me, and collapsed against my chest, shaking so hard I thought he might vibrate right out of his skin. I held him tight, whispering into his hair, breathing slow and steady, so he could feel my heartbeat, my calm, even if mine was threatening to shatter. After a few minutes, when Mason could breathe normally again, I called it in, straight to the sheriff's office, no middlemen, no HOA intermediaries. I gave my name, my badge number, a brief description of the assault, and Karen's full information. They knew me. They knew I wasn't someone who called in false alarms. Within 20 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies were on our lawn, taking statements. Mason sat beside me on the porch, his hands trembling in his lap, the taser incident already burning a permanent scar into his memory. I kept my arm around him the entire time. I gave my full account of every word, measured, clear, concise. The deputies were professional, sympathetic even, but there was a hesitation in their eyes when I mentioned who the suspect was. Karen Holloway, HOA president, local power broker. I saw it. The same hesitation I'd seen too many times before when politics infected justice. Still, they did their jobs. They found Karen hiding inside her house, 3 streets over, frantically scrubbing her phone. She was arrested without incident, handcuffed in her own driveway, while her nosy neighbors peeked through blinds and snapped photos. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Within 24 hours, the HOA issued a community safety alert, an official-looking email blast, written in the same saccharine language Karen used to deliver fines. The alert warned residents about an unfortunate misunderstanding involving the misuse of private surveillance and aggressive provocations by certain residents. They didn't name us, but everyone knew exactly who they meant. Karen was cast as the poor, beleaguered victim, defending herself against escalating threats from the non-compliant elements of the community. The irony was so thick it could have choked you. The people who had watched Karen berate my son, stalk our house, snap unauthorized photos, and install illegal surveillance equipment were now being fed a sanitized version of the truth, polished and edited and shoved down their throats like gospel. I knew how propaganda worked. I'd seen it before. You flood the narrative until people are too tired to fight it. You create a bigger enemy so your sins seem smaller. I requested a meeting with the HOA board again. This time, they didn't even bother responding. I left voicemails. I sent certified letters. I got nothing. Meanwhile, fines continued to arrive like clockwork. 150 for inciting public disturbances, because Mason had shouted when Karen chased him with the taser. 200 for unapproved exterior modifications, because my new camera was visible from the street. 300 for failure to maintain community harmony, because my wife dared to hang a single strand of blue fairy lights across our porch rail for Mason's birthday. The charges were bogus. Designed to break us financially and emotionally. Designed to grind us down until we either moved or surrendered. I contacted the sheriff's office for updates. Karen had been arrested, yes, but the charges were still pending review by the county attorney. Word was, she was pulling every connection she had, whispering into every willing ear that she was the real victim, that the evil cop and his violent son had ambushed her poor, helpless self in her moment of vulnerability. It was more than just Karen now. It was a network. The HOA board members, their spouses, their friends at the zoning office, the planning commission, even a few sympathetic voices in the sheriff's department who owed favors to the wrong people. I wasn't fighting a woman anymore. I was fighting a system, one that protected its own no matter how much blood they spilled or lies they told. Mason stayed inside after that, refused to scooter, refused to walk to the corner store alone, refused to step into his own yard unless one of us was standing watch. His freedom, the very thing a kid should take for granted, had been stolen by the people who claimed to care about community values. Watching him cower in the living room, afraid of the world outside, did something to me. It hollowed me out. It sharpened me. It made something old and dangerous rise up inside my chest, something that had been asleep since my academy days, maybe even longer. They had picked a fight with the wrong family. They had tried to turn my son into a criminal. They had turned my home into a battlefield. Fine. I knew how to fight on battlefields. I knew how to win on them too. I looked out over the neat rows of matching mailboxes, the sterile clipped hedges, the identical beige stucco houses. West Willow Preserve had declared war on us. I was done playing defense. It was time to take the fight to them, brick by brick, law by law, fact by documented fact. They had tried to break us. Now I was going to break their entire system. And Karen Holloway's taser was just the match that lit the fuse. The Monday after Karen's taser stunt, I sat at our kitchen table, a fresh legal pad laid out in front of me, the old battle instincts coiling tight beneath my skin. No more waiting, no more defending, no more hoping the system would right itself. It was time to go tactical. First move, information warfare. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the County Zoning Board, Building Department, and Planning Commission, every agency Karen's HOA touched when it flexed its muscle over this neighborhood. I requested surveillance approvals, complaint logs, citations, property modification records, emails, anything with her name or the HOA's name attached to it. It was tedious work, grinding and slow, but I knew that paper trails were how empires fell. At the same time, I started drafting civil rights complaints. Formal, notarized paperwork documenting Karen's violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act for her attack on Mason. I compiled every fabricated fine, every forged curfew notice, every video clip of HOA patrols following Mason and photographing him without cause. I documented every illegal surveillance pole installation, citing statutes about private property monitoring without consent. If the HOA wanted a paper war, I would bury them in it. It was while I was dropping off a packet of these documents at the county courthouse that I met my unexpected ally. I recognized her face before I remembered her name, Alyssa Morgan, 2 streets over, who I vaguely recalled had once worked in government law. She was coming out of the recorder's office, a stack of files under her arm, her face tight and grim. Our eyes met in that way people's do when they recognize a fellow soldier in the same foxhole. She nodded toward my envelope. "Let me guess," she said dryly. "Oh, problems?" I gave a humorless laugh. "You could say that. Assaulted my son with a taser last week. Still waiting for charges to stick." Her eyebrows lifted. "Karen Holloway?" I nodded. Alyssa's mouth thinned into a cold, professional line. "I'm a former federal prosecutor," she said quietly, "and she's been harassing my husband and me for 2 years. Illegally threatened to fine us for domestic disturbances after we hosted a birthday party for my mother, who's deaf and communicates in ASL. She shifted the files under her arm. She fined us for excessive gesturing, visible from the street." My jaw locked. This wasn't just about one rogue HOA president anymore. It was systemic rot. It was targeted abuse wrapped in layers of fake legality. "Want to swap notes?" I said. She smiled tightly. "More than that. Let's burn her house of cards down." Over the next 2 weeks, our operation unfolded like a tactical deployment. Alyssa knew exactly how to draft airtight complaints, how to cite obscure sections of law that made city clerks and county recorders sweat. I knew how to collect admissible evidence, proper chain of custody, clear authentication, multiple redundancies. Together, we made a lethal team. She showed me how Karen had systematically funneled HOA dues into a shadow maintenance fund, then used that fund to hire unlicensed security personnel, her so-called patrols, who terrorized kids on bikes and harassed teenagers for loitering at the park. She pulled property tax records that showed Karen had quietly reassessed properties she didn't like, using trumped-up HOA fines to force owners to sell at a loss, then flipping the homes to preferred buyers, who somehow never got fined at all. We compiled sworn statements from elderly residents who'd been cited for made-up infractions until they gave up and moved to assisted living. We gathered video of HOA security detaining teenagers at the pool illegally, without cause, without even the pretense of authority. Karen's power base was rotten. It just needed the right shove to collapse. And the best part, she had no idea the ground was crumbling under her feet. To the casual observer, Karen still acted like a queen at the height of her reign. She doubled down on her harassment campaign. The HOA issued a new batch of regulation-strict noise ordinances during observation hours. No exterior lights visible from the street after 9 p.m. Immediate compliance required for all citations or face compounded fines. She sent out more patrols, emboldened them to harass Mason even more openly. One afternoon, I caught 2 HOA volunteers tailing him halfway to the end of our street. I followed them right back to Karen's house, took photos, logged license plates. Karen thought she was tightening her grip. She didn't see the noose tightening around her own neck. Meanwhile, Alyssa and I worked in the shadows. We built a database of homeowners who'd been wrong. We reached out to them quietly, carefully. Some were cautious at first, afraid to get involved. Others, once they realized they weren't alone, were furious enough to sign affidavits on the spot. There was the Patel family, fined $1,200 for excessive cultural decorations after putting up Diwali lights. There was old Mr. Hansen, fined repeatedly for the crime of using a wheelchair ramp that disrupted curb aesthetics. There was Mrs. Everett, whose security camera captured Karen entering her backyard during a random inspection, without notice, without permission, and without a warrant. They were scared, but they were ready. The silent majority had found its voice. Every name we collected, every statement we notarized, every photograph and citation we archived it, all fed the growing mountain of evidence we were building against her. And still Karen pushed. She called the sheriff's office again, filed a counter-complaint claiming ongoing intimidation by aggressive elements in the neighborhood. She circulated petitions to enhance HOA enforcement measures, including proposals for private neighborhood patrol vehicles. She held secret meetings with the board behind closed doors. She wasn't trying to cover her tracks. She thought she was untouchable. That was her fatal mistake. Because every desperate move she made, every overreach, Every new violation, we documented it. We filed it. We added it to the case. Every action she took to cement her power just gave us more ammunition to destroy it. I stopped walking around the neighborhood. I started moving through it like an undercover op, quiet, observant, gathering intel, watching alliances form and fracture in the subtle nods between neighbors, in the lowered eyes of board members who once followed Karen's every word and now couldn't meet her gaze. Change was brewing. You could feel it in the way conversations stopped when Karen walked into the room. You could see it in the way her emails were no longer answered with dutiful affirmations, but with terse acknowledgments or not at all. Karen hadn't just picked a fight with me. She had picked a fight with the one group that would never back down once it smelled blood, the wounded and the wronged. She thought fear was her weapon. She forgot that once people stop being afraid, they start being dangerous. And in West Willow Preserve, the tide had turned, quietly, irrevocably. We weren't a neighborhood anymore. We were an insurgency. And Karen Holloway was about to find out what happens when you corner the wrong people for too long. Because we weren't just going to beat her at her own game. We were going to destroy the entire rotten empire she built and leave nothing of her rule but a cautionary tale whispered between the hedgerows. The reckoning was coming, and it was already too late for her to stop it. The day the summons landed on Karen Holloway's porch, it might as well have been a bomb. It was delivered not by mail, not slipped quietly into a box, but hand-delivered by a deputy in full uniform. A thick stack of legal documents, tucked under his arm. Civil suit. Federal violations. Child endangerment. Unlawful use of a weapon against a minor. Abuse of authority under the HOA charter. Misuse of HOA funds for personal and political purposes. The whole mountain we had built, months in the making, collapsed onto her in one massive, shattering blow. I watched from my window as she opened the envelope, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She stood there, in her perfect beige suit, in her perfectly landscaped front yard, looking like she had been personally struck by lightning. For the first time since moving into West Willow Preserve, Karen Holloway had no control over the narrative. She couldn't issue a citation to make it disappear. She couldn't gather her minions for a closed-door emergency session. This was federal now. This was bigger than her clipped voice and her endless stream of fake bylaws. This was real. 3 days later, we sat in federal court. Alyssa Morgan at the head of our legal team, crisp and lethal in her black suit. Evidence binder so thick it needed its own rolling cart. The judge, stern, sharp-eyed, and thoroughly unimpressed, called the session to order. The defense tried to delay, of course. They cried foul, tried to argue that this was a simple community dispute blown out of proportion. They tried to paint Karen as the real victim, spinning their usual web of half-truths and crocodile tears. It took exactly 37 seconds of playing the footage, Karen cornering Mason with a live taser, screaming incoherently about trespassing on his own property, before the judge leaned back in his chair and took his glasses off with a slow, deliberate sigh. "Counselor," he said, voice like grinding stone, "unless you can explain to me how a grown woman threatening a minor child with a weapon constitutes acceptable neighborhood governance, I suggest you stop wasting this court's time." Karen's face crumbled, right there in the courtroom. Her carefully composed mask cracked open for everyone to see: panic, rage, terror, disbelief. Her lawyer tried to whisper to her, but she batted his hand away like a drowning woman refusing a life preserver. The judge ordered an immediate evidentiary hearing. No delays, no continuances. And then, he dropped the bombshell. A federal injunction was issued, freezing all HOA accounts and operations pending the outcome of the trial. No more fines, no more surveillance, no more patrols. Karen's entire empire was locked in legal concrete. News spread through the neighborhood like a firestorm. Homeowners who had lived in fear for years now stepped out of their houses, blinking into the sunlight, like survivors crawling out of a bunker. People stopped pretending. They started talking. And they weren't afraid anymore. It wasn't just Karen who was panicking. The entire HOA board started falling apart at the seams. One member resigned the next morning via a 3-line email. Another tried to backpedal and blame Karen for everything, claiming he had been misled into approving the illegal surveillance project. The treasurer tried to clean out the HOA reserve fund and wire it to a private account, was caught within hours, handcuffed on his own manicured lawn as neighbors watched from their porches, sipping coffee with glee. Karen tried to run next. She filed for an emergency sale of her home, packed her designer handbags into her SUV, and tried to flee before the civil suit could hit her assets. Too late. A court officer intercepted her at the edge of the neighborhood, papers in hand, slapping a lien on her property so fast she didn't even have time to buckle her seatbelt. That night, her emergency motion for settlement arrived in our lawyer's inbox. A desperate offer: she would resign immediately, pay a small fine, agree to stay off the HOA board for 5 years. Alyssa laughed out loud when she read it. "Tell her to stick it," she said, and drafted a reply so sharp it could have drawn blood through the screen. No deals, no mercy. Karen would see this through in court. 2 weeks later, we held the first community-wide emergency vote in West Willow Preserve's history. Under the emergency clause of the HOA charter, which Alyssa had dug out from the dusty original filing documents, the homeowners had the right to dissolve the board by a simple 2/3 majority if systemic corruption or abuse was proven. The evidence was overwhelming. The turnout was staggering. Ballots overflowed. The final tally wasn't even close. 93% of the neighborhood voted to dissolve the current HOA board permanently. Karen's name was struck from every ledger, every document, every record. Her supporters, few as they were by then, slunk away in silence, stripped of any authority they had once wielded like a cudgel. A restraining order was issued against Karen personally, barring her from holding any leadership position in West Willow Preserve ever again. She wasn't even allowed to attend board meetings as a private citizen. She couldn't file complaints. She couldn't harass. She couldn't even set foot on common property without written permission. Karen Holloway, the queen of the HOA, the tyrant of the sidewalks, the self-appointed defender of community harmony, was now the ghost of a regime nobody wanted to remember. In her place, a new association formed. Transparent, accountable, with bylaws rewritten to prevent even the whisper of the abuses we had suffered. No secret cameras, no fake fines, no kangaroo courts. Just neighbors, working together the way it was supposed to be. The first action of the new board was symbolic, but it hit harder than any lawsuit. They took down the old HOA sign at the entrance to the neighborhood, the one Karen had ordered years ago, polished bronze with the words, "West Willow Preserve Harmony Through Order," engraved across it. It was replaced with something simpler, something stronger. A white stone plaque, clean and plain, with bold black lettering that read, "West Willow Preserve. No tyrants, no tolerance." I stood there that afternoon, arms crossed over my chest, Mason by my side. He looked up at me, a glint of the old light in his eyes, the light that fear had stolen but freedom had restored. Then, without a word, he dropped his scooter onto the fresh pavement and took off, wheels spinning, hair flying, laughter bubbling out of him so pure it almost broke me in two. No patrols chased him. No cameras followed him, no clipboard warriors waited around the corner. Just a kid, riding free, under the open sky. My wife leaned against my shoulder, silent but smiling, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I let myself breathe all the way in. Karen Holloway's reign was over. Her empire was rubble. Her name was a cautionary tale. And in the end, she hadn't just lost her power. She had lost the one thing she could never steal from the rest of us, the simple, stubborn joy of living free. In West Willow Preserve, freedom rang louder than fines. Laughter rolled heavier than citations. Justice, once caged and buried under bureaucracy, now walked every sidewalk, every driveway, every backyard, and it would stay that way. Because some battles are fought with fists, and some with fire, but the ones that matter most, the ones that reshape the world, are fought with truth, with patience, and with the refusal to ever bow again. We didn't just take back our neighborhood, we took back ourselves. Forever.